On the morning of December 18, 1982, a small body was pulled from the murky waters of the Big Black River in Mississippi. She was just a toddler, maybe 18 months old, with blonde hair and blue eyes. Someone had dressed her carefully. A pink and white check dress, white shoes, clean and new. For nearly 40 years, nobody knew who she was. The community called her Delta Dawn, after a song that seemed to capture her tragedy. But what investigators finally discovered would reveal a story far more heartbreaking than anyone imagined. Before we dive into today's story, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe to Seek Stories for more mysterious disappearance cases. The Big Black River cuts through west-central Mississippi like a dark ribbon, winding through forests and farmland before eventually joining the Mississippi River. In December of 1982, the water ran cold and deep, swollen from winter rains. It was the kind of place where fishermen knew every bend, where locals had spent their whole lives learning the river's moods and secrets. On that December morning, the river gave up one of those secrets. A man walking along the riverbank near Sherrard, Mississippi, noticed something in the water. At first glance, it looked like debris, maybe a doll caught in the current. But as he got closer, his stomach dropped. This wasn't a doll. This was a child. The Coahoma County Sheriff's Department arrived within the hour. What they found would haunt them for decades. The little girl appeared to be between 12 and 18 months old, with fine blonde hair and blue eyes. She was dressed in a pink and white check dress with white ruffled trim. White shoes covered her tiny feet. Diaper. Everything clean, everything new-looking. Whoever had dressed her that morning had taken care. But the circumstances surrounding her passing raised immediate questions. The medical examiner's report would later reveal details that confirmed what investigators already suspected. This wasn't a simple tragedy. This wasn't a case of wandering off or getting lost. The evidence pointed to something far more troubling. The detectives stood on that riverbank, looking at this tiny girl who should have been opening Christmas presents in 2 weeks. And they asked the questions that every investigator asks when a child is involved. Who is she? Where did she come from? And most importantly, what happened here? They expected answers quickly. A missing toddler, surely someone had reported her. A child this young doesn't disappear without panic, without frantic phone calls, without a parent's desperate search. They checked local reports. They expanded their search to surrounding counties, then to the entire state. Nothing. No missing person reports matched. No frantic parents calling in. No relatives searching. It was as if this little girl had never existed at all. The case went to the FBI. They entered her into the National Crime Information Center database. Her description was circulated across the region, then the country. Investigators were confident someone would recognize her. A neighbor, a relative, a daycare worker. Someone, somewhere, must have known this child. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Still nothing. The community of Coahoma County couldn't let her be forgotten. Someone suggested calling her Delta Dawn, after the Tanya Tucker song that had been popular a decade earlier. The song told a story of a woman in a faded dress waiting for someone who would never return. It seemed fitting somehow. This little girl, dressed in her neat outfit, waiting for someone to claim her, to say her name, to bring her home. They buried her in a small cemetery, the headstone reading simply Delta Dawn. Local residents tended the grave. They brought flowers. They never forgot. But they also never learned her name. The investigation continued, but leads dried up. Detectives followed every tip, no matter how small. They checked birth records, hospital records, welfare records. They interviewed anyone who had been in the area that December. They looked for witnesses who might have seen something, anything unusual. The case went cold. Not because investigators stopped caring. Not because they gave up. But because in 1982, the tools we have today simply didn't exist. DNA analysis was in its infancy. Genetic genealogy was science fiction. The databases that would eventually revolutionize cold case investigations were decades away from being created. So Delta Dawn remained a mystery. A tiny ghost with no name, no family, no history. Just a pink check dress and a grave that people visited. wondering who she had been, what her life might have looked like if circumstances had been different. The years passed. 1980s became 1990s. The century turned. Investigators retired, but before they did, they always made sure to brief their replacements about Delta Dawn. The case file stayed active even when there was nothing new to add to it. The little girl in the Big Black River became one of those cases that haunted everyone who touched it. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that the answer had been there all along. It was just waiting for technology to catch up to the tragedy. In 2007, 25 years after Delta Dawn was found, something changed. The DNA Doe Project, a volunteer organization dedicated to identifying unnamed victims, was founded. They used cutting-edge genetic genealogy, the same technique that would eventually catch the Golden State Killer, to give names back to the nameless. Delta Dawn's case caught their attention. The Mississippi authorities had preserved biological samples from the little girl's body. In 2007, that seemed like a miracle. Back in 1982, when she was found, DNA testing was barely used in criminal investigations. But some forward-thinking investigator or medical examiner, had the foresight to preserve samples. Just in case. Just in the hope that someday technology would catch up. That someday had arrived. The DNA Doe Project extracted DNA from the preserved samples and created a genetic profile. Then they uploaded it to GeneMatch, a public genealogy database where people upload their DNA results to find relatives and build family trees. It's the same database that millions of people use to discover their ancestry, to connect with long-lost cousins, to trace their roots back generations. But for Delta Dawn, it would be the key to finally learning her name. The genetic genealogists got to work. They started finding matches, distant relatives who shared DNA with the little girl. Third cousins, fourth cousins, people who had no idea they were connected to an unsolved mystery from 1982. From these matches, the team began building a family tree, working backwards through generations, trying to narrow down which branch Delta Dawn belonged to. This kind of work requires incredible patience and skill. Genetic genealogists are part detective, part historian, part mathematician. They trace birth records, death certificates, marriage licenses. They follow families as they moved across the country, changed their names, started new lives. They look for gaps. Missing people, unaccounted children, breaks in the family line that might indicate someone who vanished. Took years. The DNA Doe Project worked methodically, building out the family tree in all directions. They contacted potential relatives, asking for DNA samples to confirm relationships. Some people were eager to help. Others were confused about why they were being contacted about a case they'd never heard of. A few refused entirely, not wanting to dig into family history that might reveal uncomfortable truths. But slowly the circle narrowed. By 2019, the genealogists believed they had identified Delta Dawn's possible family line. They thought they knew which family she belonged to, but knowing the family wasn't the same as knowing her name. They needed to find the specific person, the specific child, who had gone missing in 1982. The problem was, nobody had reported her missing. That detail haunted the investigation. How does a toddler disappear without anyone noticing? Without anyone filing a police report? Without anyone asking questions? The answer, when it finally came, would be more disturbing than investigators anticipated. The genealogists began looking into every child born around 1980 or 1981 in the family line they'd identified. They cross-referenced birth certificates with death certificates. They looked for children who appeared in birth records but then seemed to vanish from public documentation. No school enrollment. No medical records after a certain point. No social security activity. That's when they found Gwendolyn Clemens. Gwendolyn, known as Wendy, had given birth to a daughter in 1981. The baby's name was Alicia and Heinrich. According to birth records, Alicia had been born healthy. But after that initial record, there was nothing. No pediatric visits. No daycare enrollment. No trace of the child in any database. It was as if Alicia Heinrich had simply ceased to exist sometime after her birth. The DNA Doe Project contacted investigators in Mississippi. Could Delta Dawn be Alicia Heinrich? The timeline matched. The age matched. And critically, There was no record of what had happened to Alicia after her birth. She hadn't been adopted. She hadn't been placed in foster care. She wasn't living with relatives under another name. She had vanished. But proving that Delta Dawn was Alicia required more than circumstantial evidence and family trees. They needed definitive DNA confirmation. The team reached out to Gwendolyn Clemens, Alicia's mother, for a DNA sample. But Gwendolyn had passed away years earlier, in 2003. They couldn't get a direct maternal match. So they turned to other relatives. Alicia's possible siblings, extended family members, anyone who might share enough DNA to confirm or rule out the connection. The process was delicate. Imagine getting a phone call telling you that the unidentified child found in a river nearly 40 years ago might be your sister, your cousin, your niece. That the little girl the community had mourned as Delta Dawn might actually be someone you were connected to, someone you might have known existed. The DNA came back. It was a match. Delta Dawn was Alicia and Heinrich. After 38 years, the little girl in the pink check dress finally had her name back. But with that name came a flood of new questions. What had happened to Alicia? Where had she been living before she ended up in the Big Black River? And most importantly, who was responsible for what happened? Investigators began piecing together Alicia's short life. What they discovered painted a picture of a childhood marked by instability and neglect, of a little girl who had fallen through every crack in the system designed to protect children like her. Alicia and Heinrich was born on November 11, 1981, in Kansas. Her mother, Gwendolyn Clemens, was in her 20s, already struggling to care for her other children. According to family members interviewed after the identification, Gwendolyn was known to move frequently, often leaving her children with relatives or friends for extended periods. In 1982, the year Alicia disappeared, Gwendolyn was reportedly living a transient lifestyle. She moved from state to state, sometimes with her children, sometimes without them. Family members remembered seeing a toddler with Gwendolyn during this period, a blonde-haired little girl who might have been Alicia. But nobody could say for certain what had happened to her. This raised a crucial question. If Gwendolyn was Alicia's mother, and Alicia had been with her in 1982, why hadn't Gwendolyn reported her daughter missing when Alicia's case became one of Mississippi's most haunting mysteries? The answer, investigators believe, is that Gwendolyn knew exactly what had happened to her daughter, and she had chosen to remain silent. But Gwendolyn hadn't been alone during this period. According to family members and public records, she had been in a relationship with a man in the early 1980s. This man's identity became critical to the investigation. Who was he? Where was he in December of 1982? And what did he know about Alicia's final days? Detectives began tracking down everyone who had known Gwendolyn during that period. Former neighbors, relatives, anyone who might remember seeing her with Alicia, or who might recall what Gwendolyn had said about her daughter's whereabouts. What emerged was a pattern of deception and deflection. According to multiple witnesses, when asked about Alicia, Gwendolyn had given different stories to different people. She told some relatives that Alicia was living with the baby's father. She told others that the child had been adopted. She told neighbors that Alicia was staying with family in another state. None of it was true. The more investigators dug, the more it became clear that Gwendolyn had been hiding something. But by the time they identified Alicia in 2020, Gwendolyn had been dead for 17 years. They couldn't question her. They couldn't confront her with the evidence. They couldn't ask her the one question that mattered most. What really happened to your daughter? So they turned their attention to the man Gwendolyn had been with in 1982. Finding him took months of work. He had moved multiple times over the decades, changed addresses, lived in different states. But eventually, investigators located him. In late 2020, detectives from Mississippi and local law enforcement knocked on his door. They explained why they were there. They told him that Delta Dawn, the little girl found in the river 38 years ago, had been identified as Alicia Heinrich. They told him they knew he had been in a relationship with Alicia's mother during the time she disappeared. Then they asked him to explain what he knew. The man, now in his 60s, claimed he remembered very little about that period. He acknowledged knowing Gwendolyn. He acknowledged that she had children. But he denied knowing anything specific about Alicia or what had happened to her. He said that if the child had disappeared, he wasn't aware of it. He suggested that Gwendolyn had probably given her daughter to a relative or friend, and that whatever happened after that, he had no knowledge of it. Investigators didn't believe him. They pressed harder. They laid out the timeline. They showed him photographs of Delta Dawn, of the pink checked dress, of the grave where she'd been buried under a borrowed name for nearly 4 decades. They explained that someone had to know what happened. Someone had to have been there. Someone held the answers. The man maintained his story. He knew nothing. He remembered nothing. If something tragic had happened to Alicia, it was news to him. Without physical evidence directly linking him to the scene, without witnesses who could place him with Alicia on that December day in 1982, investigators hit a wall. DNA had given them Alicia's name, but it couldn't tell them the full story of what happened or why. The biological samples preserved from 1982 didn't contain DNA from anyone else. No unknown perpetrator's genetic material that could be tested and compared. The case was stuck. Detectives went back through the original investigation files from 1982, looking for anything they might have missed. They reviewed witness statements from people who had been near the Big Black River in December of that year. They looked at vehicle records, checking for cars that might have been registered to Gwendolyn or her boyfriend at the time. They found a possible connection. According to records, a vehicle matching a description similar to one associated with Gwendolyn's boyfriend had been seen in the area around the time Alicia's body was discovered. A witness from 1982 had reported seeing a car parked near the river, but at the time, with no reason to connect it to Delta Dawn, the lead hadn't been pursued aggressively. Now, with the identification complete, that detail took on new significance. But a car seen in the area wasn't proof. It wasn't enough to bring charges. It wasn't enough to overcome the decades that had passed, the memories that had faded, the evidence that had been lost to time. Investigators also looked into whether there had been any signs of abuse or neglect in Alicia's short life. The medical examiner's report from 1982 had noted that the toddler appeared well-nourished and well-cared for physically, at least in the immediate period before her passing. The clothes she wore were clean and in good condition. There were no signs of chronic malnutrition or previous injuries that had healed. This suggested that whatever happened to Alicia, it might have been a sudden event rather than the result of ongoing mistreatment. But it also raised more questions. If Alicia had been cared for, if she had clean clothes and appeared healthy, why would someone allow something tragic to happen to her? Was it an act of anger, of desperation, an attempt to hide something else? The investigators reached out to behavioral analysts and child protection experts, trying to understand what might have motivated someone to be involved in what happened to an 18-month-old child and then leave her body in a river. The experts suggested several possibilities. It could have been an act of rage by someone overwhelmed by the stress of childcare. It could have been an attempt to eliminate a witness to some other crime. It could have been the result of mental illness or substance abuse affecting judgment. Or it could have been something more calculated, an attempt to make a child disappear so that uncomfortable questions wouldn't be asked. That last possibility seemed to fit with Gwendolyn's pattern of telling different stories about where Alicia was. If Gwendolyn had wanted people to stop asking about her daughter, if she had wanted to move on with her life without the complication of explaining where her toddler had gone, then making Alicia disappear entirely would have been one way to achieve that. But why? What would motivate a mother to participate in, or at minimum cover up, the tragedy that befell her own child? Investigators discovered that Gwendolyn had struggled with addiction during this period of her life. Multiple family members confirmed that she had used drugs and alcohol heavily in the early 1980s. Some suggested that her addiction had made her neglectful of her children, that she had often prioritized her own needs over their welfare. Could addiction have played a role in what happened to Alicia? Could Gwendolyn have been so impaired that she didn't protect her daughter from someone dangerous? Or worse, could her impairment have led her to make a terrible decision about Alicia's future? These were questions that would never be fully answered. Gwendolyn was gone. The man she had been with denied everything. And Alicia, the only other person who knew what really happened in those final hours, had been silenced forever. But investigators weren't ready to give up. They decided to approach the case from a different angle. Instead of focusing solely on who was responsible for what happened to Alicia, they began investigating why her disappearance had never been reported. They looked into whether Gwendolyn or anyone else had actively hidden Alicia's existence, making it easier for her to vanish without raising alarms. What they found was troubling. Alicia appeared to have had minimal documentation of her existence beyond her birth certificate. There were no hospital records after her birth, no welfare case files, no immunization records. It was as if after she was born, she had been kept off the grid entirely. This raised the possibility that Gwendolyn had deliberately avoided creating a paper trail for Alicia. Perhaps she had never enrolled her daughter in any government programs. Perhaps she had never taken her to a doctor for routine checkups. Perhaps she had kept Alicia hidden, moving from place to place, never staying long enough for anyone to ask questions about the toddler in her care. If that was true, it would explain why nobody reported Alicia missing. If very few people knew she existed in the first place, then when she disappeared, there would be nobody to file a report, nobody to ask where she had gone, nobody to search for her. It was a devastating realization. Alicia had been invisible in life, and she had remained invisible after her passing for 38 years. Only the dedication of the Coahoma County community, who had refused to forget Delta Dawn, and the persistence of genetic genealogists, who had refused to let her remain nameless, had finally given her back her identity. But identity wasn't justice, and justice was what Alicia deserved. In December of 2020, exactly 38 years after she was found, the Coahoma County Sheriff's Department held a press conference. They announced that Delta Dawn had been identified as Alicia and Heinrich. They explained how genetic genealogy had cracked the case. They asked the public for any information about what had happened to Alicia in the months and weeks before December of 1982. The response was overwhelming. The local community, who had tended Delta Dawn's grave for decades, was relieved to finally know her name. But that relief was mixed with sorrow. Now they knew that this little girl hadn't been a stranger who happened to be passing through Mississippi. She had been deliberately brought to that river. Someone had dressed her carefully, then left her in those cold waters knowing she would be found. Family members who hadn't known what happened to Alicia came forward. Some had been children themselves in 1982, too young to ask questions about where their cousin or niece had gone. Others had been told lies by Gwendolyn and had simply accepted those explanations, never imagining the truth was so dark. One relative told investigators that she had asked Gwendolyn about Alicia in the late 1980s. Gwendolyn had claimed the child was living with her father in another state and doing well. The relative had believed this. Why wouldn't she? It was the kind of arrangement that happened in families all the time, a child living with one parent or the other moving between households. She had never suspected that Alicia was already gone. Another family member recalled seeing a news report about Delta Dawn years ago, back in the 1990s. She had thought the little girl in the artist's rendering looked familiar, but she hadn't made the connection. Alicia was supposed to be alive, living somewhere else. The possibility that she was the unidentified child in Mississippi had never crossed her mind. These revelations highlighted one of the most insidious aspects of Alicia's case. How easy it had been for her to disappear because nobody was looking for her. In families where communication is strained, where people move frequently, where children are passed between relatives, it's possible for someone to slip through the cracks. Gwendolyn had exploited that reality, using the natural disconnection in her extended family to hide what had happened to her daughter. The press conference also reignited public interest in the case. True crime enthusiasts, who had followed Delta Dawn's story for years, were shocked to learn she had finally been identified. Online forums erupted with discussions about who might be responsible. Amateur investigators combed through public records, trying to piece together Gwendolyn's movements in 1982 and identify potential suspects. This surge of public attention brought both help and hindrance to the official investigation. On one hand, tips poured in from people who remembered seeing Gwendolyn during that period, or who had information about her associates. On the other hand, the speculation and theorizing sometimes spread misinformation, complicating the work of determining what was factual and what was rumor. The Coahoma County Sheriff's Department made it clear the case was now being actively investigated. They were pursuing leads, and they were determined to find answers about what happened to Alicia, even if nearly 4 decades had passed. But as months went on, the challenges became apparent. Witnesses from 1982 were difficult to locate. Many had moved away. Some had passed away. Others had memories clouded by age and time. Physical evidence from the original scene was limited. Forensic techniques in 1982 were nothing like what we have today. The DNA that had identified Alicia couldn't tell them who was involved in her tragedy. By mid-2021, the investigation had slowed. Detectives continued following leads, but the reality was stark. Without new evidence, without a witness willing to come forward with concrete information, the case might never be fully solved. Alicia's name was no longer a mystery, but the circumstances of her final hours remained frustratingly unclear. The community of Coahoma County held a second burial service for Alicia. Her headstone was updated with her real name, Alicia and Heinrich. Family members attended, some meeting each other for the first time. Brought together by the tragedy of this little girl they had never known or had lost contact with decades ago. It was a bittersweet moment. After 38 years, Alicia finally had her identity. She had family claiming her, mourning her properly. But she also had justice denied. The person or people responsible for what happened to her remained free, untouched by consequences. For the investigators who had worked on the case, particularly those with the DNA Doe project who had spent years building the genetic genealogy tree that led to Alicia's identification, there was a sense of partial success. They had given her back her name. They had connected her with family. They had ensured she would be remembered not as Delta Dawn, a borrowed name from a sad song, but as Alicia, a real child with a real history. But they also knew their work wasn't done. Identifying Alicia was just the first step. The next step, finding justice, remained elusive. The case continues to be investigated to this day. The Coahoma County Sheriff's Department periodically releases updates, asking for information. They maintain that new leads are still being pursued. They hold out hope that someone with knowledge of what happened will come forward, that a witness who has remained silent for decades will finally find the courage to speak. Because somewhere, someone knows what happened to Alicia and Heinrich in December of 1982. Someone knows why she ended up in that river. Someone knows who dressed her in that pink check dress for the last time. Someone knows the truth. And until that person comes forward, or until new evidence surfaces, Alicia's case will remain open, solved in name but not in justice. The story of Alicia and Heinrich of Delta Dawn represents both the best and worst of how we handle missing and unidentified children in America. It shows us the devastating consequences when a child falls through the cracks, when nobody reports them missing, when their existence is so minimally documented that they can vanish without anyone noticing. But it also shows us the power of persistence and advancing technology. The community of Coahoma County refused to forget the little girl in their river. They tended her grave for 38 years. They kept her memory alive. And when the technology finally existed to give her back her name, the DNA Doe project and law enforcement worked tirelessly to make that happen. Alicia's case has had a lasting impact on how unidentified remains are handled. It's become a model for how genetic genealogy can solve cold cases that seemed impossible. The techniques used to identify Alicia have since been applied to hundreds of other cases, giving names back to people who had been lost to time and tragedy. Her case has also sparked important conversations about child welfare and reporting. How do we ensure that every child is accounted for? How do we prevent children from being so invisible that they can disappear without anyone noticing? What systems need to be in place to protect the most vulnerable? These are questions that don't have easy answers. But they're questions that Alicia's story forces us to confront. Every child deserves to be seen. Every child deserves to be documented. Every child deserves to have someone who will notice if they're gone. For the people who worked on Alicia's case, the genealogists, the investigators, the community members who never stopped caring, there's a bittersweet pride in what was accomplished. They gave a nameless child her identity back. They connected her with family who mourned her. They ensured she would be remembered. But they also live with the frustration of knowing that full justice hasn't been served. Someone was involved in what happened to an 18-month-old child and left her body in a river. That person has never been held accountable. That person has lived freely for 4 decades while Alicia remained in a grave marked with a borrowed name. The hope is that someone, somewhere, will see this story and decide that the secret they've kept for 38 years is too heavy to carry anymore. That someone will come forward with information that can finally bring closure to this case. That someone will choose to speak the truth, even after all these years. Alicia and Heinrich was 18 months old when her life ended. She never got to celebrate a second birthday. She never went to school. She never made friends. She never got to experience all the things that every child deserves to experience. Her life was cut tragically short by someone who should have protected her. And for 38 years, she lay in a grave under a name that wasn't hers. But now we know who she was. We know her name. We know her birthday. We know where she came from. And we remember her, not as Delta Dawn, the mystery, but as Alicia, the child who deserved so much better than what she got. If you have any information about what happened to Alicia and Heinrich in December of 1982, please contact the Coahoma County Sheriff's Department in Mississippi. Even the smallest detail, something that seemed insignificant at the time, could be the piece of information that finally brings justice for Alicia. Thank you for watching. If you found this story meaningful, please consider subscribing to Seek Stories and sharing this video. Every share helps keep Alicia's memory alive and increases the chance that someone with information will come forward. Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts on this case, and let us know what other unsolved mysteries you'd like us to cover. Remember Alicia. Say her name.